So unfortunately, Colleen Molloy is not here tonight, so we're not going to hear her talk on the work that Leicester City of Sanctuary has done for people looking for refuge in the UK and trying to access higher education. But I know probably everyone knows about City of Sanctuary. Leicester City of Sanctuary is one of the main charity working to support refugees and asylum seekers, and the Leicester branch, obviously, helping people living in Leicester. Now we have
a lot of the education opportunities for people who, so you said for asylum seekers and refugees, yeah, but also people who have come to the end of line in terms of their asylum appeals. So technically they're failed asylum seekers, or the government expects those people to return to country of origin, but on many occasions they just end up living this life in limbo. So would that group of people be able to access some of the education courses or the scholarships that you've mentioned as well?
Yeah, probably the distance learning option is the most relevant there. I mean, the thing is, there are always going to be technical barriers for people if they are in limbo or if they're living in an environment that isn't well equipped. As long as they're living in, like Chiron's learners living in Germany, they're generally pretty close to free Wi-Fi wherever they are.
Okay.
They'll have a mobile phone that they can actually access a lot of the materials on. If one of those, and I mean in the UK as well, there are resources that people can access more easily. If they get deported maybe back to Afghanistan or Somali or something like that, they might find they're in a camp with very few resources. There are often in refugee camps, there are centres that provide those kinds of resources, but it's much harder to access them, and there's a lot of work to be done in that area. So theoretically it's possible, but it would depend on that individual's circumstances.
Yeah, I just think some people have been living in those circumstances for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years even.
Yeah.
So even though the government's intention is that they're not able to stay, the reality of their lives is that they've got this vast amount of time.
I think it would also depend on what their bail conditions are, because the people that would appeal back exhausted are more likely to have a no-study condition attached to their stay in the UK, in which case it would be illegal for them to study. What constitutes formal education is not fully defined, so I think it's a very grey area to say that they'll be able to do a formal course online and still be within their bail conditions. So.
I mean, we've had a student who was studying with us who received a message that she'd exhausted all of her possibilities. I think she continued and finished the course with us, so we don't sort of differentiate on that. As long as we're not sort of breaking any regulations. I think it's not directly connected to your answering your question, but I think this also brings up how staff need to kind of adjust. I mean, my staff are having to sort of face situations, if you like, that they're not used to, and as a department we're doing our best to offer training and around sort of trauma and things like that. But it's a new ball game for us in some ways.
And not so much in this group, but I'm not sure how to link with prevent and that kind of policy. So we've always been quite anxious in higher education about students who are here on visas. But the universities sort of have a bit of an obligation to report to the Home Office that they're here and are studying as they say they are. But in UCU we've always been a little bit anxious of this almost being that the universities are being asked to become the police. And we don't like this whole idea of having to report to the Home Office. That I think all we do now is just tell them that yes, they're here and they're involved. But we're always anxious when things like, for example, the university brought in a new system where you have to swipe into a lecture to say that you're there, and the last thing we want is for the Home Office to get hold of information that a student who's here on a visa dared to be sick one day, for example, and not turn up. And so I was a bit anxious that kind of thing could be used to monitor people who are here on perhaps questionable legality, left in limbo for a long time, who technically shouldn't be accessing education, but have been in that limbo for such a long time that they need to carry on with their lives as well.
Yes. I just wanted to ask people if anybody's aware of MIG app. I'm sure people are. MIG app. It's an app that a lot of migrants use and a lot of asylum seekers use, and provides things like information on migration services, money transfers, medical, global incidents, migration office in whatever particular country they happen to be in, country information. They also have stories from individual migrants and asylum seekers which kind of resonate with other users. But for instance, this interface could accommodate an aspect on education, and I think they would be open to that being, fielded to them. They are run by the United Nations Migration Agency, but if you just look on your phone, if you go into, whatever it is, and just look for the app, MIG app, M-I-G app, and they're very, very approachable, and they will respond. They respond very quickly. And I think if there was something there about the scholarships that you mentioned, education opportunities, access courses and so forth, that would be a great plus. Thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I think it's very unfortunate that access provision seems to have virtually disappeared, and I don't know whether that's correct or not, because quite often, I'm going back a few years now, that was a very good way for asylum seekers and refugees to become orientated socially within whichever area they were living in, but also to get the English language and just, I suppose, familiarise themselves with the British way of teaching, which I know can be very different depending on what cultural background they're from and what experiences they've had. But it gave them, I felt, a very good introduction into the world of HE, and was usually a relatively smooth transition for them from that level 3 education to higher education. So I don't know whether people would care to comment about that. And my other question is about whether there are conversion courses. So refugees and asylum seekers who are here, who are already highly qualified, as you said, but it's the business of being able to transfer their qualifications so you get the correct equivalence in this country, but also being able to give them the English language skills in whatever it is that they're qualified in. So years ago there used to be something called PLAB, which was for people who were medically qualified. They would do that course and then they'd be ready to do whatever the British medical conversion qualifications were. I don't claim to know a lot about it. And I think there was something similar for legal, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And I just wondered what the current situation is in terms of those conversion courses. So it's access and conversion I'm interested in.
My understanding of access courses, there are access courses available at Leicester College. Our experience has been that the young people that have done the pre-access course whilst asylum seekers have been asked to pay for that, which has not been affordable for them. We've had students, I think it's science and humanities only that they do. The students that have wanted to do medical degrees and dentistry have had to go to London to try and access the courses there. So it is very, very limited. And the feedback that we've had from the students about the access as opposed to pre-access courses, their understanding is that it's a ticket to university, but it doesn't in itself constitute a qualification. And they're worried about not being able to follow through to university within those 2 years, and then they've got nothing to show for that 2 years of study and maybe have to do it again if they get an opportunity to go to university. So, and those students have favoured the BTEC route rather than because the A-level route isn't available to them. But we've had very limited take-up from our young people at the access courses. As far as conversion, I only know a couple of people that have wanted to do that, and they went to Manchester to do it.
The Leicester Adult Learning Service from this year is offering access and pre-access courses which are in the social sciences, business studies area, but I don't know whether they're in a position to offer any favourable finance in relation to those, but those are being offered at Beaver Street, Wellington Street as of this year. this is obviously speaking about something aspirational, but the courses that we previously offered through the Vaughan Centre and the courses that we hope will be able to offer from next year are accessible courses in the sense that we don't expect A-levels for people to start on higher education courses, that people will start with a certificate. So the courses that the university has effectively shut down by withdrawing our provision, we want to sustain these courses. So they might be of interest in the future if we can find a way of helping, supporting with the finance. The finance remains obviously a big problem, but we hope from September 2019 that we'll be offering courses where people can start at certificate level without necessarily having mainstream qualifications, and we might work with people, for example, often we get people to produce a written piece of work to demonstrate their level of knowledge and their capacity to receive higher education. But we haven't required those formal things, it's not part of the UCAS system. So where those courses exist, they are possibly another route.
I was going to just add a point onto that, just kind of situating that, what you're talking about, the kind of lack of access courses in comparison to where it used to be. I think that's partly a result of dispersal, which is when in the early noughties, the government basically suggested that rather than asylum seekers being able to be settled anywhere, they settled them outside of the southeast particularly, and the southeast was the area where there were the most refugee support groups, where most of the access courses were, where most of the educational opportunities were as well, and that move where asylum seekers were essentially sent out of the southeast to kind of towns which were essentially cheaper to house them in, meant that a lot of the support services were cut in that process. And so while I can't comment specifically about stuff in Leicester, that kind of just situates where that disappearance has come from and why so much is having to be rebuilt in the kind of refugee sector currently.
I have some difficulty with the discussion, with the issue of acquiring English as the means to progressing. In this sense, I feel there needs to be really a structural change in place which looks at bilinguality or multilinguality as an incredibly enabling intellectual process. And so, you know, I think that's something that we need always to keep in mind when we're looking, you know, well, I think that's it.
Thank you. Can I also add to this? In my experience as I work at Leicester University as well. I've been teaching for a while, and actually it's not always the case that students really can talk in English. We have many international students, so I think it's also a question about which university we live in. It seems more likely that if you've got the money to pay on your tuitions, then you're welcome at university, and it doesn't matter whether you can really speak English. Obviously, I mean, students are accepted and they have, you know, a certificate to prove that. But still, I just wanted to add on this point. I think that we have to value bilingualism and people speaking different languages. But also, I don't understand why sometimes they, you know, put a stress on the English level requirement for maybe just asylum seekers or refugees, while we know that in English universities nowadays that's kind of an issue.
I have to say, as a person who works at university, I have a real issue with the way that academics treat the English language anyway. I think we write very badly, often in an incredibly convoluted and complicated way, you know, using 10 words when one could do. I mean, I did a maths degree and have an appalling GCSE in English, so that's my written English. I have a PhD now, but my written English is absolutely appalling. So I think it's very unfair that often we hold these people to a higher standard than what many of us would meet often. This is why I think that the way things should be assessed should really be looked at. If someone can pass an exam verbally or do a different way, then there should be a different way of approaching it.
But even because, so just further again, of course, even my English, right? But we live in a university where it relies upon many international workers and international students. So it is already an international university. So indeed, English is important, but yeah, maybe we should look at more and different ways
Yes.
Just to add to that, I would say, just to be clear, that they have the same entry requirements in English for refugees and asylum seekers as for any other international student. In fact, as far as I understand it, people who don't have an English entry requirement are academics.
No, they do. No, sorry about
Yeah, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, of course, we need to take it some to
But just to kind of, you know, I totally take your point that there are occasionally some students who you kind of think, how did they get that level?
No, I didn't want to say that they don't, but I feel like it is important, the English, but again, we have sometimes a misconception that everyone at university speaks perfect English. First of all, I mean, I don't, as a, a worker of the university, I don't want to say.
But I think in the context of
workers,
this, it's important to say that there's no differentiation between, for students.
There was behind, sorry.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of people who fairly recently come into this, I'm going to speak, I have a number of different hats, and my hat at the moment is for the Quaker Asylum and Refugee Network, which is speaking out against the immorality of the system that we've got. So years ago, people used to have a TV licence when they lived in NAS accommodation, and they used to have free ESOL lessons when they were part of the asylum system. And that's all part of this hostile environment that's been created when that was removed from them, because the government said, why do we want to spend money on them when they're going to be going home anyway? We don't want to encourage them to stay. And that is still here. The fact that this government at one time was saying that people should be allowed to drown in the Mediterranean because otherwise it would encourage other people to come. That's what we're dealing with. And so I would ask universities to speak out very loudly about unnecessary blocks that are put in your way when you're trying to help people who are already in the asylum system. And then thinking about refugees, my friend went to Montfort University and did law and public policy. After that, it's like, what do you do next? He didn't have the money to go and do the training to be a solicitor, and to be a barrister you need 2 masters, I don't know, all this stuff that you need in order to get an actual job. So this is great, it's part of a process, but at the end of that there's a lot of disappointment if you can't use it. But the other thing is that people might bring stuff to this country that's helpful to us, but that particular person has been at the UN talking in the Syria talks and has used his knowledge gained from De Montfort University to try and help sort out what's happening in his own country. So there are benefits to what's happening here that are far-reaching. So I congratulate the universities for getting on board with all of this, but it started the process. The other thing I wanted to say was that when my friend was doing law and public policy, there were a lot of phrases used by teachers which just didn't make sense because it was colloquial English. And so if part of that could be about using everyday English in all the courses, that would be very helpful.
Can I just say one thing about that? There's a group that we work quite closely with, Growing Points, if you kind of Google them, who one of the things that they try to do is to help people get into access work. So they might be, lawyers who they work with people who would like to get into that area, or they work quite closely with the NHS as well. So that's one way, Leicester, that we're trying to work on the next step as well.
Oh, okay. So my question is kind of like similar to her, like the ultimate goal of getting higher education is to get a job. So I just want to ask, is there like collaboration with kind of industry to have refugee or asylum seeker to get, like, maybe if they're not here, maybe if they go out the UK to somewhere so they can have like enough or like a skill that needed to get a job, to get like at least salary or kind of benefit that they can get from their job to survive.
I can answer that. I think what's very easy for people to say is that once someone's left a scholarship as a refugee, they have exactly the same opportunities as any other citizen who's graduated. And actually that's like statistically not true. In most cases, refugees overwhelmingly face odds of discrimination based on their background. So even if someone's very, very highly qualified, it's far less likely they'll be accepted onto a employment course of that qualification in the UK than they would in their place of origin. Like just recently, I had to answer an email from someone, and I'm sure anyone working in this field has often encountered these kind of emails where someone says, I'm a qualified doctor, I've come from a country and I've arrived here in the UK, I've got refugee status, I'm completely qualified, ready to go. I can't get a job, I'm working in a cab shop, I have been for the last 2 years. And so I think it's a really, really good point that, in fact, a lot of the employment opportunities which you kind of expect come from graduation are not automatically given to refugees. I think what we've kind of said a little bit and touched upon about in terms of access and pre-sessional courses is they also try and focus, and they should try and focus on employment skills. So as well as looking at UCAS applications, job skills as well is a really, really important way of doing that. There isn't enough provision at the moment to get people into work. I mean, I think anyone in the UK who's a graduate faces difficulties in accessing employment. There's only very few people who are lucky enough to have those connections to get straight into a job. And it's not always the case that those jobs are very good. So I think refugees are almost against the odds twice as graduates, and that is something which needs to be worked on.
And also there's currently a campaign which is, because one of the challenges that makes life particularly difficult for people who are looking for refuge is that immigration laws, they are not normally allowed to work. So currently there's a campaign which is asking the UK government to remove the restrictions that are currently there, where they say that for you to be able to apply for permission to work, you need to have been caught up in the asylum system for over a year. That there's a campaign which is saying that that provision should be removed. And what makes it worse, which can also, there's a question at the back of it, which builds on the questions that we asked earlier, is that when you are in the immigration and asylum system, you can be caught up in it for decades. There's a person who is known to the Red Cross in Leicester who has been going through the process for over 20 years. And in that 20 years, you're not allowed to work, you're not allowed to study, you can meet the disruptions that we've seen recently where you start studying and then you're told you cannot. I think universities, when you go along with that, you're actually colluding with a system that is repressive, oppressive, needlessly cruel. I think you've got a responsibility to say, this isn't right. So there's a comment in the question.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think sometimes the more controversial that statement, the more likely it is to take root in the public's mind. And I think there is, what you said about the centenary of the university, these stories are very, very powerful. Let's not forget that amongst us here that we have our own stories, stories of refuge and seeking asylum, stories of change, family histories that are very rich, and we can share those things. But in sharing those things, I think the important point that was made there is about universities can actually be agents of that invoke change, provoke it even, and stand up and actually create that dynamic change that we need. But we're all fearful, aren't we, because we live in an environment which is not particularly supportive. But I think all the more reason actually to stand up and be counted. And I think if you've got the platform as a university, you can do an enormous amount of good. You really can.
If I could just make a couple of points about that. One very small one, and it's only a very small thing, but one of the career service at the university sort of agreed, and we're just working with them, that not only will they work with existing students, but they'll also work with any refugees and asylum seekers in terms of offering their expertise, which I think would be positive. And going on what you're saying, I don't know if anyone was there recently, because David Attenborough sort of launched the centenary celebrations, and much to my absolute delight, he used most of his speech to talk about his history of having sisters who were adopted as refugees. So, yeah, I mean, getting people to sort of speak out, I think is really important. People with high profiles as well. A little bit of a defence, maybe, to the leadership of the university, which I don't normally subscribe to. They have been supportive about this, kind of actively quite supportive about it, which is a positive.
I think it's a very fair point that universities have a responsibility in society, I think, to speak out. I think universities have become very afraid over the last few years generally about having strong opinions on things, and perhaps haven't reacted in the way that perhaps I would have liked them to. I mean, an example, recently the PhD academic who got arrested on made-up charges of espionage whilst doing PhD fieldwork, and I can't remember what country it was.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. And I would have liked universities to have spoken out a lot more and boycotts, not the students from Saudi Arabia, but perhaps boycotted sending any academics to Saudi Arabia, been a lot more vocal, and instead I didn't feel like there was much of anything really from the university sector, and I think it probably just demonstrates that perhaps we're all a little bit afraid of being too political in the current climate, not wanting to take sides, but at the same time, I mean, the basis of tonight's discussion is that education is a basic human right. Surely that's not terribly controversial. So I think the stuff that Leicester University is doing around university sanctuary and so on is an excellent start. I just think it's a shame that I won't go on too much that it was done 2 years after shutting down Vaughan, which I think was a wonderful example of a form of education that was alternative and helped other people learn who wouldn't have learnt through traditional routes of higher education. So I think the sector as a whole perhaps needs to take a look at it, but then it starts with those of us that are members of staff at universities, those of us that are students at universities, speaking up and encouraging people in senior positions to take a stance on these things.
Sorry, it's going to sound very pedestrian in comparison to the conversation that we're having at the moment. I'm also interested in foundation years at university, because that can be another way of accessing traditional higher education in terms of the levels. And in particular, I'm interested in University of Leicester, because there was a discussion probably about 3-4 years ago about having a foundation year for medicine.
Yeah, we have one as of this year. As of this year, I must confess I don't know whether it's been set up with this group of people in mind. I mean, my understanding is that it's been set up more for people who have flunked their A-levels. However, I would really hope that if they had a student that didn't have A-levels, they'd seriously take a look at taking them on. But it's in its first year, so this is now a 6-year medical degree rather than a 5-year medical degree, which I think is a good idea. I mean, just even for home students, we all mess up and need a second chance, and I think a university should be about second chances for all students who want it. But I'd hope the University of Leicester would look very favourably on someone like this applying for the foundation year.
Thank you.
Yeah, the situation in Leicester currently, because it's a very valid point, is the majority of the foundation provision at Leicester is a private provider. It was study group, and it's about to become a different private provider. What I'm trying to do is sort of get it into their thinking that they might offer some free places supporting our initiative as a university of sanctuary, but as you can imagine, that's not high on the university's leadership's kind of points to negotiate at the moment, but I see it as, if you like, my job to kind of push that a little bit. And yeah, medicine is always a tricky one, because obviously it's seen as being so expensive, so giving any kind of free places is seen by some people as being difficult. I'm not saying I'm one of those people, but
it's a bit. I mean, I completely agree. That is often the way people see it. Not helped by the fact that it's a 5-year degree rather than more, rather than the amount of facility that has to go into it. At the same time, our NHS is in desperate need of doctors,
Yeah.
nurses, and you'd have thought offering a few, or conversion courses as you were talking about, which isn't so easy for people to, train them up.
Yeah, Leicester, like you mentioned, it also has a number of CARA students as well, I think 5 or 6 at the moment.
I mean, there's a good example of this business of doctors as well. In Leicester, there is, amongst the Syrian community, there's 5 doctors, but they can't practice in this country because their qualifications aren't recognised. Now, if you see the hoops that those people have got to jump through to be able to join the NHS, I mean, I'm surprised they haven't given up before they start, to be quite honest. The English test is, which you, Philip, know more about than most people. I actually have done it, and it is actually, I found it quite difficult, and it was simply difficult because the language used I didn't think was particularly clear in parts either. But that's only part of it, because when they've done that, they've then got to go through more medical training to them to be able to get the certificates, and it's years.
It's also very expensive.
Of course, yeah, because none of it, apart from the English lessons that the University of Leicester run, none of it is free.
Yeah, actually on that, because we're offering the lessons for free, and RefuAid have agreed to pay for their exam fees as well, which is really positive.
You do pay for the IELTS qualification or other?
Yeah, RefuAid will pay for it, yeah.
Another issue on the medical side, I've got a colleague in National City Sanctuary who does some conversion training. He is himself a doctor. And apparently one of the issues at the end of the conversion training is that a doctor coming from Syria or wherever then has to get a certificate from the equivalent of the BMA in his home country to say he's a bona fide doctor in wherever it is, Syria, Iraq, wherever. Now, if you've actually fled that country, it may not be in the interests of a nationally sponsored body in your country of origin actually to acknowledge that you exist. So it's a sort of final hurdle, apparently, at which a lot of people trip.
Going back to the foundation issue, I know that we've had some conversations about some of our students who do have their qualifications and wanting to access foundation courses, but they're geared for international students, and because they're now home students, because they've got no refugee status, they can't access any finance to do those courses and expect to pay international fees. But that would be a way that would cut out all this scrabbling around in effort. You try and get the right qualifications and get them directly into university where they would get some support.
I don't know whether I'm meant to tell you this, but actually in the year before they decided to shut us, we were working with the uni on creating a whole lot of foundation programmes. And one of the first signs that they were going to shut us down was that they pulled all of that. So till quite recently, I think you have to understand, and this is a brutal thing to say, and my colleagues will forgive me, universities are selling education, and they want to have courses where they can charge the full £9,000, if not the international fees. And they make some fairly brutal decisions about this, how the sorts of students they want to get and the sorts of fees they want those students to pay. And this is why I think all honour to the colleagues who are working in that system to try to get the universities to recognise their moral obligations, but it is hard because that is not the sort of people who end up high up in universities are motivated by quite different understandings of the value of education, and it's a value which is not written, in human souls, it's written in cash.
We're seeing this echoing as well because the colleges are very business-like in how they approach students, and this is why we're not seeing a full range of GCSEs on offer, because they're not viable. Because
they haven't
not
a viability marker.
Just slightly in defence of the universities, it's not entirely their fault that they are acting like that. The government has set up a whole new liberal equality where universities are supposed to fight for their survival. They're being pitted against one another through the so-called teaching excellence framework and things like that. So our campaign has to go beyond university.
I'd like to raise another structural issue linked to language, and that is the issue of plagiarism. If you are learning another language, you have to, and particularly where you've got these different levels at which you have to be able to produce this language, you're going to, and I mean, I think this goes right back into the fact that a lot of English people do not have an experience of learning another language. You have got to go through a stage in which you're memorizing a whole sequence of words and that kind of thing. And as a teacher, as a lecturer, I was involved in defending students who were accused of plagiarizing when I could see that they were just trying to acquire this level. It's a structural issue, though.
Yes. Yeah, and that kind of goes back to my comment about how perhaps traditional assessment doesn't necessarily suit everybody and everybody's learning style. That's not necessarily even just the case for people who speak English as a second, third, fourth language. I mean, that's often the case for people with English as a first language, that if it can be assessed in a different way via a conversation rather than via an essay, then perhaps it's worth universities generally thinking outside the box. Because there's only so many ways you can say something, to be honest, isn't there, when you worry about, I remember when I did my maths degree, worrying that by citing Pythagoras' theorem I might be done for plagiarism, because you can only say it the way that Pythagoras said it, to be honest, and that's all there is to it. But, so, I mean, I can't imagine, you do see them where they put it through Turnitin, that awful system, and it says this is 80% plagiarised from, this Wikipedia page or whatever. And I do have a lot of sympathy for that, because especially if English isn't your first language, there is only so many ways you can learn to say it. And my attempts to learn French, je m'appelle Sarah, my name is Sarah, I was taught to say it that way, and that's the only way I can say it. So I think there needs to be a real rethink of how people are assessed at university. It shouldn't be a memorisation test, and it shouldn't be a test of who can write something in the most complex and convoluted way possible. It should just be about who has acquired the skills to think critically and think outside the box and question society. That's what university is really supposed to be about.
I have a couple of questions for Mark and Phil. I was just wondering, what's the main difference between the scholarships that are offered at the Montfort University and those that are offered at Leicester universities? Because you mentioned that, so from my understanding, the majority is a distant learning. I understand the reason why it's like that, but I was wondering, those people that manage to get a scholarship in distant learning, are they allowed to go to lectures or to go to the library to access other facilities at universities or not? Just because I had some friends that are recently applying for these scholarships and they were wondering,
distance learning is not something that is done at Montfort University for asylum seekers and refugees, but obviously those that come in on scholarships have full access to all the facilities. They are treated and they are just like any other student at university. In fact, the people that work in our student support services who support students throughout will tell you that one of the big things that people going through scholarships, they don't want anybody else to know that they are on a scholarship. They just want to be treated like any normal, in inverted commas, student. Which, of course, the paradox of that is that makes it difficult for us then to promote scholarships and what they've done, but their welfare comes before any marketing, to be quite honest.
And are the scholarship across all disciplines, so scholarship for medicine, for
yes,
law, or just
well, there would be if we had medicine, but yes. So in other words, you can apply. The way it tends to work, and it's very practical, to be quite honest. If you get one of the scholarships, what you get is your fees paid plus 3,200 and something pounds, and there's one scholarship where the student gets free accommodation. Now, because of that, the practicalities are that most of the Article 26 scholarships goes to people that either live in Leicester or can realistically commute or have family in Leicester, because there's no point as giving a student from, I don't know, Torquay, because they're not going to be able to afford to sustain themselves in Leicester. So there is a practicality that goes with that.
Just to add to that, actually, one thing I'm starting to work on is to make the qualifications that they get from us transferable to other universities. So, you know, as I said earlier, there's lots of scholarships that are out there that are not being used. But if someone's passed a pre-sessional at Leicester, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to go and do a degree at Leeds or Cardiff or wherever. So I'm hoping that this time next year that we would have some kind of agreement in place around that. As for differences, I tend not to think of it, I don't think we think of it in this way. I think it's all about working, working together. I mean, this is not some kind of competition that we have 10 scholarships or we have 12 at all. It's about, trying to fill as many places as we can. And as I say, with what we're doing with English language, I think that is an opportunity to sort of, if people can, they could go to another university maybe because Leicester doesn't offer it, or that scholarship is not available there, or they can go down the road to Dumont. I'd be as happy if they went to Dumont as I would.
I was just wondering if maybe the Montfort was offering for particular courses and maybe Leicester for others, because some came from.
There is an obvious difference in courses, yeah. So, I mean, we've also talked, and this is an interesting debate that we've had recently over the business of qualifications and A-levels, because of course universities set various courses and say you need whatever graded A-level, but of course it's within the remit of universities to offer unconditional places, and that's been the whole point recently when we were talking about this Aspire scheme, that if we have interviews with students and the students quite clearly are at a level but just don't have the qualifications because of their own personal circumstances, then can't they be awarded an unconditional offer in the same way that it's done commercially? And I think the answer is basically yes, that is something that needs to be looked at and considered, because that then removes one of the barriers.
When I did my undergraduate degree, even before I'd taken my A-levels, I took a maths paper for the university that I was going to go to and got offered an unconditional offer. So they said my maths ability is purely independent of my A-levels, and there needs to be perhaps more of that. Not necessarily again as an exam, but some way of assessing it and considering unconditional offers more.
I mean, teachers in sixth forms hate unconditional offers. They go berserk at us for offering them. But this is one where a commercial operation can be used for basically for public good.
Can I just comment on that?
Yes, of course you can. You're going to disagree with it fundamentally, aren't you?
Yes, I was up at Ladder one day ranting about it. Unconditional offers are fine for some students, but in the population of students who receive unconditional offers, they're on a spectrum, and some of them will approach that with real pride and say, this is a demonstration of the fact that the university that I'm applied to really has faith in me, they really want me to go there, and I'm going to work really hard to make sure that I demonstrate their faith in me and that I get those qualifications, whatever grades, that's fine. But at the other end of the spectrum, they're the ones I'm worried about, because they sit back and they say, oh, unconditional offer, that's fine, put my feet up. That's not fine, because it means when they get to university, they quite often have a lower level, they have a lower level achievement than they are capable of, and therefore they have a bigger gap to make up when they get to university, when they're dealing with all of the changes, if they're moving away from home and all that stuff. And if they fall off the tracks, and the probability of them falling off the tracks is significantly higher because of that, plus other things, and general attitude towards learning, they then have lower qualifications than they would have done. And those are the qualifications that they will be using to do something else, whether it's to get employment, to get onto another course or whatever. So how is it working for them?
No,
I'm not expecting you to answer.
No, I'll quite happily answer. Personally, I agree with you completely. My point I was trying to make was that there's a loophole within the system that on this occasion could be used to assist asylum seekers that are quite able to be able to get into universities.
I agree. But I was just responding to
yeah.
sixth form colleges going out. That's why.
Yeah.
I just hope it would still be quite rigorously assessed.
That of course, because
young people, there's no point setting them up to fail.
No, of course
people
not.
aren't always aware of the rigours of university.
Yeah, it was like we had this conversation. There is quite clearly a group of students that are able, and they're able to undergo university for life, but don't have A-levels at a certain grade. Now, nobody knows the number that would be interested in joining university until you actually explore it. But it seems unfair to make that student jump through hoops that are very difficult to do to try and get A-levels that aren't available. When really, if they are able, there is a loophole within the system that would allow them access to university. But don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating. My son was offered an unconditional offer at one university, and it's surprising the number these days that are out there, unconditional offer. And he wouldn't do it for the very reasons you said. But universities are increasingly making unconditional offers because it guarantees them students, and it's part of the commercial ethos.
Just to pick up on that point, I mean, it's the role sending, somebody who's not doing their bit that impacts on the learning of others, spot the ex-head teachers here. But the one thing I was going to say is that what carries a lot of currency in schools is basically that, the social capital of being a university of sanctuary. Because schools do a lot of work with their students in terms of social education, and imbuing them with the skills to go out into a wider world. And you will find that if you go into schools now, that is a huge part of the offer. It's not always successful, depending on the environment in which the schools operate, which can be a real sort of blockage to any of those higher sort of aspirations. But you will find that most secondary school students now will have an awareness of social issues that extends to refugees and asylum seekers. And I would say that a university that offers that has a wider audience and has the ear of a lot of students. And that is due to the hard work of the heads actually in the schools that promote that.
I think Phil would agree with me on this, that when students want to volunteer, two of the biggest opportunities they ask for are working with refugees and working with the homeless.
Yeah.
And I would say that as a rule, that's out of step with what we assume to be the general thinking in the British public.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yes, I think that's absolutely spot on.
Right, unless there are other questions, I think it's about time to wrap up. So I shall just first of all remember that at the table at the entrance there are the Christmas cards from After 18 and the book edited by Ambrose, Poems on the City. I would like to thank everyone that took part in this fantastic discussion. And I would like, Miriam, if you want to say some words about things.
So, on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank Ambrose for bringing us together this evening. Thank you all for coming and taking part, and I wish everyone a safe journey home. Okay?